Every mother knows the ache of a child lost to secrets and silence. For 20 winters, Sigrid has carried the weight of not knowing why her son was banished from their village. When she saves Jarl Edvin's life during a deadly raid, he offers her 3 wishes. Most would ask for gold or land. But Sigrid's first wish shocks him. She wants the truth about her son's exile. The powerful ruler has kept this secret buried for 2 decades. Now an aging shield-maiden will use her wishes to uncover betrayals that were meant to stay hidden forever. What truth was so dangerous it cost a mother her only child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the memories that haunted Sigrid's dreams. She stood at the edge of her small plot of land, watching the sun struggle through the grey clouds that seemed to mirror the weight she carried in her chest. 20 winters had passed since Magnus left, or rather, since he was forced to leave, and still she found herself scanning the horizon each dawn, hoping to see his familiar silhouette returning home. Her weathered hands traced the silver pendant at her throat, a small Thor's hammer that had protected her through countless battles. The metal was warm against her skin, worn smooth by decades of worry and prayer. She had worn it the day Magnus was born, the day he took his first steps, the day he lifted his first sword, and the day she watched him disappear into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and shame in his eyes. The village of Ironfjord stirred to life around her. Smoke rose from chimneys as families began their daily routines, but Sigrid felt the familiar isolation that had become her constant companion. She was respected here, feared, even by some of the younger folk who remembered stories of her battle. Prowess, but respect and belonging were different things entirely. At 53 winters, she occupied a strange space between the honored elders and the vital warriors, too old for the battlefield, but too restless for the fireside. Sigrid. The voice belonged to Astrid, her closest friend, and one of the few people who still spoke Magnus's name without lowering their eyes. The older woman approached with careful steps, her own joints stiff from the approaching winter. The Jarl's men were asking questions again yesterday. Sigrid's jaw tightened. Even after all these years, mention of Jarl Edvin's interest in her family made her blood run cold. What kind of questions? The usual. Whether you've heard from Magnus, whether you know where he might have gone. Astrid's weathered face creased with concern. I told them nothing, as always, but they seemed more persistent this time. The 2 women walked slowly toward the village center, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp morning air. Ironfjord was a prosperous settlement, nestled in a protected bay where the fishing was good and the soil, though rocky, yielded enough to sustain them. The longhouses were well maintained, their timber walls dark with age, but solid against the harsh northern weather. Carved dragon heads adorned the corners of the most important buildings, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the salt air from the fjord. Sigrid had been born here, as had her father and his father before him. The raven insignia on her battle-worn shield represented 3 generations of warriors who had protected this place. But loyalty, she had learned, was a more complicated thing than she had understood in her youth. "Do you remember," Astrid said quietly as they passed the communal well, "how Magnus used to sit right there, whittling those little wooden figures?" Sigrid's throat tightened. She remembered everything. Magnus, at 7 winters old, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to carve a horse. Magnus at 15, his shoulders already broad from training, teaching the younger children to make toy swords from driftwood. Magnus at 22, standing in that very spot and telling her he would not marry Helga Thornsdottir, no matter what the alliance would mean for their clan. "I remember," she said simply. They continued their walk through the village, nodding to neighbors who greeted them with the careful politeness that had replaced genuine warmth over the years. Gunnar the blacksmith raised his hammer in acknowledgement as they passed his forge, but his eyes didn't quite meet Sigrid's. Young Olaf hurried past with his arms full of firewood, mumbling a quick greeting without slowing down. Even the children seemed to sense the invisible boundary that separated Sigrid from the rest of the community. It hadn't always been this way. Before Magnus's exile, Sigrid had been one of the most celebrated members of their society. She had fought in 7 major battles, led raiding parties that brought prosperity to Ironfjord, and earned a reputation that spread beyond their own territory. Warriors from other clans knew her name. Skalds sang songs about the shield-maiden who fought like a berserker but thought like a strategist. But all of that seemed like another lifetime now. These days, she tended her small garden, helped with the harvest when her aging joints allowed, and tried to make peace with a world that had moved on without her. The longhouse that served as their meeting hall dominated the center of the village, its peaked roof rising above the other buildings like the prow of a great ship. Carved pillars supported the entrance, their surfaces decorated with intricate knotwork that told the stories of their ancestors. Inside, she knew, hung the weapons and shields of the greatest warriors their clan had produced. Her own shield had once held a place of honor there, before she requested its return after Magnus left. "Will you come to the feast tonight?" Astrid asked as they reached the crossroads where their paths diverged. "Eric's daughter is announcing her betrothal." Sigrid shook her head. She had little stomach for celebrations these days, especially those involving marriages and the joining of families. "Give them my blessing, but I think I'll keep to my hearth tonight." Astrid's expression softened with understanding. "You cannot live in the past forever, old friend." "I'm not living in the past," Sigrid replied, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. "I'm living with its consequences." After Astrid left, Sigrid made her way to the small shrine at the edge of the village, where she went each morning to make her offerings to the gods. The wooden structure was simple but well maintained, with carved representations of Thor, Odin, and Freyja watching over small piles of bread, mead, and other gifts from the villagers. She knelt before Thor's altar and placed a small portion of her morning bread at the base of his statue. "Protect him," she whispered, as she had every day for 20 winters. "Wherever he is, whatever he faces, let your hammer shield him from harm." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak that shaded the shrine. Some would call it a sign, but Sigrid had learned to be wary of reading too much meaning into the natural world. The gods spoke when they chose to speak, and the rest was just weather. As she rose to leave, her eye caught on something that made her heart skip. There, carved into the bark of the oak tree, were runes that hadn't been there the day before. The cuts were fresh, the wood beneath still pale. She traced them with her finger, reading the simple message, "Mother, soon." Her hands trembled as she looked around the empty shrine, searching for any sign of who might have left the message. But the morning was still and quiet, with only the distant sound of waves against the shore and the occasional call of a gull overhead. Magnus. Could it really be? After 20 winters of silence, was her son finally reaching out to her? The logical part of her mind whispered warnings. It could be a cruel joke, or worse, a trap set by those who wanted to use her hope against her. But the mother's heart that had never stopped aching chose to believe. Somewhere out there, her son was alive, and somehow he was finding a way to let her know. She touched the Thor's hammer at her throat and made a silent promise. If Magnus was truly coming home, she would make sure he had a home worth returning to. That meant finally getting answers to the questions that had tormented her for 2 decades. What had really happened that terrible night when everything changed? Why had the Jarl been so quick to exile her son without a proper trial? And what secret was so dangerous that it was worth destroying a family to protect it? The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full beauty of the fjord. Fishing boats dotted the water, their crews already at work hauling in the nets that would feed the village through another day. Children played in the shallows, their laughter carrying on the wind. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to the storms raging in individual hearts. But as Sigrid walked back toward her home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The questions that had haunted her for 20 winters suddenly felt less like burdens and more like quests. If Magnus was truly coming home, she would make sure he found the truth waiting for him, no matter what the cost. The weathered shield with its raven insignia hung on the wall of her small house, a reminder of battles fought and victories won. Soon, she sensed, it might be time to take it down again. Not for war, but for something even more important: justice. The attack came at dusk, when the fishing boats were returning and the village had settled into the comfortable rhythm of evening preparations. Sigrid was tending her small fire when the first war cry split the air, followed immediately by the clash of steel and the splintering of wood. She moved with instincts honed by decades of warfare, grabbing her sword and the weathered shield from the wall without conscious thought. The raven insignia seemed to gleam in the firelight as she strapped it to her arm, muscle memory taking over despite the 20 winters that had passed since she last carried it into battle. Outside, chaos reigned. Men with unfamiliar banners, the wolf head of Clan Grimson, poured through the village like a dark tide. These were no mere raiders seeking easy plunder. Their attack was organized, purposeful, aimed at the heart of Ironfjord's defenses. To the Longhouse! The cry came from Bjorn, Jarl Edvin's most trusted advisor, his grey beard already spattered with blood. Protect the Jarl! Sigrid ran toward the sounds of heaviest fighting, her aging joints protesting but her, a warrior's heart, singing with familiar purpose. A young Grimson warrior, his face painted with blue woad, stepped into her path with a savage grin. He saw a grey-haired woman and expected easy prey. His mistake. Sigrid's shield caught his downward stroke, deflecting it with practiced ease, while her sword found the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. 20 winters of tending gardens and mending clothes fell away like shed skin. She was the Raven of Ironfjord again, and these fools had chosen the wrong village to attack. The battle swirled around her as she fought her way toward the Longhouse. She could see Jarl Edvin's distinctive red cloak in the midst of the melee, surrounded by enemies who had broken through his personal guard. The Jarl was a capable warrior still, despite his advancing years, but he was outnumbered 3-1. A crossbow bolt whistled past Sigrid's ear, close enough that she felt the fletching brush her cheek. She spun to face the archer, but another Grimson warrior was already between them, his axe singing through the air toward her head. She ducked low, feeling the wind of its passage, and drove her shield boss into his knee. The joint buckled with a wet snap, and her sword opened his throat before he could cry out. "Sigrid!" Astrid's voice, high with terror, came from somewhere behind her. But there was no time to look back. The Jarl was down now, his guard overwhelmed, and a massive warrior with a bear's pelt across his shoulders was raising his axe for a killing blow. Time seemed to slow as Sigrid made her choice. She could retreat, preserve herself, and let politics take its course. Or she could do what a lifetime of honor demanded, regardless of the complicated history between herself and the Jarl. Her feet chose, before her mind could object. She crashed into the bear-cloaked warrior like a falling stone, her shoulder driving into his ribs with enough force to crack bone. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and weapons, rolling across the blood-slicked ground. He was younger, stronger, but she was desperate and experienced. Her knife, the eating blade every warrior carried, found the soft spot beneath his arm where the mail didn't quite cover. The bear warrior's eyes widened in shock, then dimmed to nothing. Sigrid hauled herself to her feet, breathing hard, and extended a hand to the fallen Jarl. Edvin's face was a mask of blood from a head wound, but his eyes were clear and grateful as he accepted her help. "My thanks," he said simply, but there was something deeper in his voice, recognition, perhaps, of debts that went beyond the moment's aid. The tide of battle was turning. With their war leader dead, the Grimson raiders began to fall back, their organized assault dissolving into scattered retreat. The surviving villagers pressed their advantage, driving the invaders back toward the ships they had beached at the fjord's edge. As the sounds of fighting faded into the distance, Sigrid found herself standing in the Longhouse's main hall with the Jarl and a handful of his surviving retainers. Her shield, now notched and stained, felt heavier on her arm than it had in decades. The broken iron sword hilt that she kept hidden beneath her cloak, the last remnant of Magnus's weapon pressed against her ribs like a cold reminder of everything she had lost. "You saved my life," Jarl Edvin said, settling heavily onto his carved chair. A thrall was already tending to his wounds, but his attention remained fixed on Sigrid. "I am in your debt." The words hung in the smoky air between them. Around the hall, other conversations died as people realized what was being discussed. A Jarl's debt was no small thing, especially one acknowledged publicly before witnesses. "Name your price," Edvin continued, his voice carrying the weight of formal obligation. "Gold, land, livestock, whatever you desire, it shall be yours." This was the moment. Sigrid felt it like a shift in the wind before a storm. For 20 winters, she had wondered and worried and grieved. For 20 winters, she had accepted that some truths were buried too deep to ever uncover. But now the gods, or fate, or simple bloody chance, had given her an opportunity she had never dared to hope for. "3 wishes," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Grant me 3 wishes, freely given and honestly answered." The Jarl's eyebrows rose. It was an unusual request, more like something from the old stories than the practical negotiations of the real world. But he had made his offer before witnesses, and honor bound him to accept. 3 wishes, he agreed. "Speak the first." Sigrid felt every eye in the hall upon her. These people expected her to ask for wealth, for security in her aging years, for the comfortable retirement that any sensible warrior would want. Instead, she reached beneath her cloak and drew out the broken sword hilt, holding it up so. The firelight caught its scarred surface. "I want the truth about my son Magnus," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I want to know why he was really exiled 20 winters ago. I want to know what you've been hiding all these years." The effect was immediate and profound. Several of the younger retainers gasped outright. Bjorn's face went pale as old bones, and Jarl Edvin himself seemed to age a decade in the space of a heartbeat, his shoulders sagging, as if an invisible weight had settled upon them. "Sigrid," he said carefully, "some truths are better left buried. Not this one." She stepped closer to his chair, the broken hilt still clutched in her fist. "You owe me a debt of honor, Jarl Edvin. You offered me anything I desired. This is what I desire, the truth about my son." For a long moment, the only sounds in the hall were the crackling of the fire and the distant shouts of men securing the village. Then, slowly, the Jarl nodded. "Very well," he said, though his voice carried undertones of deep reluctance. "But not here, not now. Come to my private chambers tomorrow at dawn, and I will tell you what you wish to know about Magnus." It wasn't the immediate satisfaction Sigrid had hoped for, but it was more than she had dared expect an hour ago. She tucked the sword hilt back beneath her cloak and gave a short bow. "Until dawn, then." As she turned to leave, she caught Bjorn's eye. The old advisor was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part concern, part calculation, and perhaps something that might have been pity. The weight of what she had set in motion was only beginning to settle upon her shoulders as she walked home through a village that smelled of smoke and blood. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of urgent conversations beginning in the Longhouse. By tomorrow, everyone in Ironfjord would know that Sigrid had used her first wish to demand answers about Magnus. The broken sword hilt felt warm against her ribs, as if it held some trace of her son's spirit. Tomorrow, she would finally learn what had really happened on that terrible night, 20 winters ago, Whether she would like the answers she received was another question entirely. Dawn came grey and cold over Iron Fjord, the sky the colour of old iron and just as unforgiving. Sigrid had not slept. She had spent the dark hours sitting by her hearth, turning the broken sword hilt over in her hands and remembering fragments of that last terrible day when everything changed. Magnus had been 22 then, strong and proud, with his father's steady hands and her own stubborn streak. She remembered him practicing with his sword in the yard behind their house, the blade catching the morning light as he worked through the forms she had taught him. That same blade now existed only as this broken remnant, snapped during the confrontation that had led to his exile. The village stirred to life around her as she made her way to the Jarl's longhouse. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear the low murmur of conversation as neighbors discussed the previous night's attack. But there was something different in the air today, a tension that went beyond the usual aftermath of battle. Word of her demand had spread, as she had known it would. Gunnar the blacksmith paused in his morning preparations to watch her pass. Old Eric, who had been sharpening fishhooks outside his door, suddenly found urgent business indoors. Even the children seemed more subdued, staying closer to their mothers as they went about their morning chores. The longhouse loomed before her, its carved pillars seeming more ominous in the pale morning light. 2 guards flanked the entrance, men she had known for years, but who now watched her approach with carefully neutral expressions. They stepped aside without a word, but she could feel their eyes following her as she passed beneath the carved lintel. Inside, the great hall showed the aftermath of the previous night's violence. Dark stains marked the wooden floor where blood had been hastily scrubbed away. The smell of smoke and iron still lingered in the air, mixing with the familiar sense of wood, oil, and old rushes. Bjorn waited for her near the carved chair where Jarl Edvin held court. The advisor's face was drawn with exhaustion, his grey beard unkempt, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much violence for one night. But there was something else there too, a wariness that spoke of deeper concerns than mere battle fatigue. "Sigrid," he said quietly as she approached, "are you certain you want to walk this path?" She studied his weathered features, noting the way his hands remained carefully clasped behind his back. Bjorn had been the Jarl's closest advisor for more than 30 years. If anyone knew the full truth about Magnus's exile, it would be him. "I've been walking this path for 20 winters," he replied. "Today I simply hope to see where it leads." Bjorn's expression grew more troubled. Some destinations are not worth reaching. Some truths bring more pain than ignorance. Before Sigrid could respond, a door opened at the far end of the hall, and Jarl Edvin emerged from his private chambers. The ruler of Ironfjord looked older this morning, his face pale beneath the bandages that covered his head wound. He moved with the careful gait of a man whose body had reminded him of its mortality. "Sigrid Ravensblood," he said formally, using the war name she had earned in her youth. "You have come to claim your debt." "I have." She stood straighter, feeling the weight of her years but refusing to bow beneath it. "You promised me the truth about Magnus." The Jarl gestured toward a smaller chamber off the main hall, its entrance guarded by heavy oak doors carved with protective runes. "Then come. What I have to tell you is not for every ear." The private chamber was smaller than the great hall, but no less impressive. Tapestries depicting great battles hung from the walls, and a fire burned in a stone hearth carved with the faces of ancient gods. A simple wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of use. On that table lay something that made Sigrid's breath catch in her throat, a fragment of carved runestone, its surface partially shattered, but still bearing the angular marks of formal record-keeping. She recognized it immediately as part of the official chronicle that documented major events in their clan's history. "Do you know what this is?" the Jarl asked, settling heavily into one of the 2 chairs beside the table. "Part of the record stone," Sigrid replied, taking the other chair. "Where we keep the official accounts of trials, alliances, and significant events." The part that recorded Magnus's exile, Edvin confirmed. I had it destroyed shortly after the judgment was rendered. Sigrid's hands clenched, involuntarily. Why? Because the truth it contained was more dangerous than the lies we told. The Jarl leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the stone fragment. Because sometimes, Sigrid, protecting a community requires sacrificing individuals, even good individuals. The words hit her like physical blows. What are you saying? I'm saying that Magnus was not exiled for the reasons we announced. The matter of his refusal to marry Helga Thornsdottir was real enough, but it was not the cause of his banishment. Edvin's voice grew quieter, more careful. There were other factors, political considerations that went far beyond a young man's romantic preferences. Sigrid stared at the broken runestone, her mind racing. What political considerations? The Jarl was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table's scarred surface. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of village life beginning, children playing, adults calling to one another, the rhythmic hammering from Gunnar's forge. But inside this chamber, the weight of old secrets seemed to muffle everything. Your son, Edvin said finally, discovered something he was not meant to know, something that could have destroyed alliances we had spent years building, something that could have brought war to our very doorstep. What did he discover? That is not a question I can answer today, the Jarl replied, though his tone suggested reluctance rather than refusal. The full truth involves others besides myself, others who still live and whose safety must be considered. Sigrid felt frustration rise in her chest like a tide. You promised me the truth, and I am giving it to you piece by piece as I safely can. Edvin met her eyes directly. Magnus was exiled not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as protection. For him, for you, and for our entire community. Protection from what? From the consequences of knowledge that was too dangerous to possess. The Jarl reached across the table and touched the runestone fragment. This contained the record of what he learned and who he learned it from. Its destruction was meant to bury those secrets forever. Sigrid studied the broken stone, noting the way the runes had been deliberately chiseled away rather than accidentally damaged. Someone had taken great care to remove specific information while leaving just enough to maintain the appearance of accidental destruction. If Magnus was being protected, she said slowly, why was he never allowed to return? Why was no word ever sent? Because the danger never passed, Edvin replied. If anything, it has grown worse over the years. The alliances that his knowledge threatened have become more crucial, not less so. His return could still bring disaster upon us all. The implications of his words settled over Sigrid like a cold fog. Her son had not been punished, he had been sacrificed, not for crime or cowardice, but for stumbling upon truths that powerful people needed to keep hidden. Who else knows this? She asked. Myself, Bjorn, and one other whose identity I cannot reveal without their permission. The Jarl's expression grew more serious. Which brings me to a warning, Sigrid. By asking these questions, by demanding these answers, you may be placing yourself in the same danger that forced Magnus's exile. She touched the broken sword hilt beneath her cloak, feeling its familiar weight. Let me worry about the danger. I wish I could, Edvin said quietly, but I fear that choice is no longer mine to make. The leather-bound chronicle felt heavy in Sigrid's hands as she sat in the dim corner of the village record-keeper's hut. Old Finn had grudgingly allowed her to examine the official village records, though his nervous glances toward the door suggested he regretted the decision. The musty smell of old parchment and ink filled her nostrils as she carefully turned the pages, searching for any mention of her son's final days in Ironfjord. You won't find much, Finn muttered, hunched over his writing desk like a protective bird. His gnarled fingers continued scratching notes in his current ledger, but his attention was clearly on her activities. The entries from that time were carefully edited. Sigrid paused at a page, dated just before Magnus's exile. The writing was Finn's careful script, but obvious gaps marked where text had been scraped away and overwritten. Whole sentences had been replaced, and in some cases entire sections had been cut from the parchment and new pieces sewn in their place. "Who ordered these changes?" she asked, running her finger along a particularly obvious alteration. "Who do you think?" Finn's voice carried bitter resignation. "The Jarl's seal is on every modification order, though Bjorn was the one who brought them to me, along with very specific instructions about what was to be removed." The pattern became clearer as she continued reading. Any mention of Magnus's activities in his final weeks had been systematically erased, replaced with vague references to disturbances and matters of clan honor. But the editing had been hasty in places, leaving fragments that hinted at a larger story. One passage particularly caught her attention. Young Magnus brought concerning reports of removed, which, if true, would implicate removed in the matter of the Northern Alliance. "The Northern Alliance," Sigrid said aloud. "What was that about?" Finn's scratching stopped entirely. He set down his quill and turned to face her, his expression troubled. "That was before your time as a warrior, but the old-timers remember. A treaty with Clan Eriksson that prevented a war that would have devastated both our peoples. What does that have to do with Magnus?" "I don't know," Finn replied, but his eyes suggested otherwise. "All I know is that after the boy's exile, the Jarl received several visits from Eriksson emissaries. Very quiet visits, very official." Sigrid felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Magnus had discovered something about the Northern Alliance, something significant enough to threaten its stability. But what could a young warrior have learned that would carry such dangerous implications? She spent another hour examining the records, noting every alteration and deletion. The picture that emerged was one of systematic concealment, not just of Magnus's alleged crimes, but of his entire activities during his final months in the village. It was as if someone had tried to erase her son from history itself. As she prepared to leave, Finn spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else you should know, though I pray you'll keep the source to yourself." Sigrid turned back to the elderly record-keeper, noting the fear in his rheumy eyes. "The night before Magnus left," Finn continued, "he came here, alone, after midnight, moving like a man being hunted. He asked to see these same records, specifically anything related to the Northern Alliance. Did you show them to him?" "I did. And what he read there, it changed him. I've never seen a young man's face go so pale, so quickly." Finn's hands trembled as he spoke. "He asked me to make him a copy of certain pages. When I refused, it would have been treason. He begged me, actually got down on his knees and begged." The image of her proud son reduced to pleading sent a chill through Sigrid's bones. "What did you do?" "I told him to leave and never speak of what he'd seen. I thought I was protecting him." Finn's voice cracked with old guilt. The next morning, the exile order came. By sunset, Magnus was gone, and by the following week, those same pages he'd wanted to copy were being cut from the records. Sigrid left the record-keeper's hut with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that her son had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple political embarrassment. The systematic destruction of evidence spoke to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of their clan's leadership. As she walked through the village, she noticed the way conversations stopped when she approached, how groups of people dispersed when she came too near. Word of her meeting with the Jarl had spread, and with it, a sense of unease that seemed to affect everyone she encountered. Near the marketplace, she spotted Astrid haggling with a fishmonger over the price of cod. Her old friend's face brightened when she saw Sigrid approaching, but the expression quickly faded when she noticed the leather-bound chronicle still tucked under Sigrid's arm. "You're stirring up old troubles," Astrid said quietly, as they walked away from the market stalls. "People are talking." "Let them talk. It's not that simple." Astrid glanced around nervously before continuing. Gunnar asked me this morning if I thought you'd lost your wits. Eric's wife crossed herself when I mentioned your name. They're frightened, Sigrid. Of me? Of what you might uncover? Of what it might mean for all of us? Astrid stopped walking and faced her directly. There are some in the village who remember the old days, who recall how precarious things were before the Northern Alliance brought stability. They don't want to see that peace threatened, even for the sake of one family's grief. The words stung, but Sigrid understood the logic behind them. A community's survival often required difficult choices, the sacrifice of individuals for the greater good. But understanding didn't make accepting it any easier. Magnus was part of this community too, she said. He deserved better than exile based on lies. Did he? Astrid's question was gentle but pointed. What if the lies were kinder than the truth? What if his exile really was meant to protect him? They had reached the shrine where Sigrid made her daily offerings. The carved runes she had discovered the previous morning were still visible on the oak tree's bark, though they seemed fainter now, as if the wood was already beginning to heal over them. Mother, soon. The message seemed to mock her with its promise of reunion while she wrestled with questions about her son's very identity. I need to know who he really was, Sigrid said, touching the carved letters. Not the Magnus I remember from childhood, but the man he became. The man who discovered secrets dangerous enough to cost him everything. Astrid's expression softened with understanding. And if you don't like what you discover, then at least I'll know the truth. Sigrid pulled the broken sword hilt from beneath her cloak, its cold metal reflecting the afternoon sun. This is all I have left of him. But truth. Truth is something I can still fight for. As the two women parted ways, Sigrid felt the weight of the village's collective unease pressing down upon her shoulders. But she also felt something else, a growing determination that had nothing to do with maternal love and everything to do with justice. Whatever Magnus had discovered, whatever truths had been buried with his exile, she would unearth them. Even if it meant standing alone against the entire community she had spent her life protecting. 3 days after her confrontation with the Jarl, Sigrid found herself sitting across from Astrid in the older woman's small cottage, both of them nursing cups of warm mead against the growing chill of evening. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but the atmosphere between them was heavy with unspoken tensions. "You've been avoiding me," Sigrid said quietly, noting how her oldest friend's eyes kept darting toward the door, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "People talk," Astrid replied, her weathered hands wrapped tightly around her cup. "They say you're asking dangerous questions, stirring up troubles better left alone. The same people who once sang songs about my courage in battle, the same people who have families to protect and livelihoods to maintain." Astrid's voice carried a sadness that spoke of difficult choices. Times change, Sigrid. What was heroic 20 years ago might be seen as reckless today. Sigrid studied her friend's face in the firelight, noting the new lines of worry that seemed to have appeared overnight. "You know something about Magnus that you haven't told me." For a long moment, Astrid said nothing. Then, with visible reluctance, she rose and went to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From beneath layers of woolens and household linens, she withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "I've kept this for 20 winters," she said, returning to her seat. "Magnus gave it to me the night before he left, with instructions that I should only return it to his mother if certain conditions were met." She unwrapped the leather to reveal a silver arm ring, its surface engraved with the distinctive wolf design of Clan Eriksson. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of piece given only to mark significant alliances or deep personal bonds. Sigrid's breath caught in her throat. "Where did he get this?" "From her," Astrid said simply. "From Ingrid Eriksdottir." The name hit Sigrid like a physical blow. Ingrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarl Erik the Bold, ruler of the northern clans, and architect of the very alliance that had brought peace to their region. a woman whose political importance was matched only by her reputation for fierce independence and keen intelligence. Magnus was involved with Ingrid Eriksdottir? Sigrid's voice was barely above a whisper. More than involved. They were lovers for nearly 2 years before his exile. Astrid turned the arm ring in her hands, its silver surface catching the firelight. This was her pledge to him, given in secret during one of the treaty negotiations when she accompanied her father to Aram, the territory. Sigrid felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Magnus's refusal to marry Helga Thornsdottir suddenly took on new meaning. He hadn't simply been rejecting an arranged marriage. He had been choosing between political duty and a love affair that could have destroyed the most important alliance their people had ever forged. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because no one else knew, except for myself and one other person who helped arrange their meetings. Astrid's expression grew more troubled. Someone who had as much to lose as Magnus if the affair became public knowledge. Who? Astrid hesitated, then spoke a name that sent ice through Sigrid's veins. Bjorn, the Jarl's most trusted advisor, the man who had been present at every crucial moment of Magnus's exile, the person who had personally delivered the modification orders to Finn, the record keeper. Bjorn helped them meet? Sigrid struggled to process this revelation. He was in love with Ingrid himself, had been for years. When she chose Magnus over him, he could have exposed them both. Instead, he helped them because he genuinely believed their love might find a way to strengthen the alliance rather than destroy it. Astrid's voice carried the weight of old sorrows. He was wrong, of course. Love rarely conquers politics. Sigrid stared at the silver arm ring, her mind racing through the implications. If Bjorn had been involved in facilitating the relationship, then his role in Magnus's exile became far more complex than simple political necessity. What happened? What forced Magnus to leave? Someone discovered them. Someone who saw an opportunity to use their secret for personal gain. Astrid rewrapped the arm ring carefully. Ingrid was supposed to marry a powerful ally from the eastern clans, a match that would have secured her father's southern borders. If her relationship with Magnus had become public, it would have destroyed not just that marriage, but potentially the entire web of alliances that kept our region stable. So Magnus was sacrificed to preserve political arrangements. It wasn't that simple. Astrid's voice grew urgent. Magnus discovered that the person who had exposed their relationship was also selling information to rival clans. He learned that someone within our own leadership was betraying alliance secrets to enemies who would use them to break the peace. The silver arm ring seemed to grow heavier in Sigrid's imagination as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. Magnus hadn't just been an inconvenient lover. He had become a threat to a traitor operating at the highest levels of their society. Who was the traitor? That's what Magnus was trying to discover when he was exiled. That's why he went to Finn seeking copies of the Northern Alliance records. He believed the evidence was hidden in the official documents. Astrid leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And that's why his exile had to happen so quickly, before he could piece together the full truth. Sigrid felt anger building in her chest like a forge fire. Her son had been betrayed not just by political necessity, but by someone who was actively working against their people's interests. The exile that had been presented as a difficult but necessary choice was actually a cover-up designed to protect a traitor. Does the Jarl know? I believe he suspects. But suspicion without proof is dangerous, especially when it involves someone close to him. Astrid's expression grew fearful. Which is why I've kept this secret for 20 winters, and why I'm terrified to be sharing it now. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. The sound seemed to underscore the gathering storm that Sigrid could feel building around her investigation. Magnus is alive, she said suddenly, thinking of the carved runes at the shrine. Somewhere out there, he's alive, and he knows the truth about who betrayed him. Then he's in more danger than ever, Astrid replied. Because if he returns with evidence of that betrayal, he won't just be threatening political stability, he'll be threatening someone's life. Sigrid stood, feeling the weight of decision settling upon her shoulders. The silver arm ring represented more than just a love affair. It was evidence of a conspiracy that reached the very heart of their leadership. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, she had to uncover the full truth. "I need to speak with Bjorn," she said. "Sigrid, no. If he was willing to sacrifice Magnus once to protect the alliance, what makes you think he won't sacrifice you as well?" "Because this time," Sigrid replied, touching the broken sword hilt beneath her cloak, "I'll be ready for betrayal." The charred letter fragments lay scattered across Sigrid's table like pieces of a broken heart. She had found them hidden beneath loose floorboards in Magnus's old room, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from decay, but not from the fire that had nearly destroyed them completely. Only portions of words remained, but even these fragments told a story that made her chest ache with recognition of young love and impossible choices. "Cannot bear another day without seeing your face." Read one piece. The ink faded, but still legible in Magnus's careful script. "If we could find a way to make them understand." Read another, this one in a more delicate hand that must have belonged to Ingrid Eriksdottir. Sigrid held each fragment up to the candlelight, trying to piece together the correspondence that had sealed her son's fate. The letters spoke of secret meetings, of dreams for a future together, and of growing desperation as political pressures mounted around them. One fragment caught her attention with its urgency. "Discovered who has been feeding information to the eastern clans. Must meet tonight at the old shrine. Bring the proof we found." The old shrine, the same place where she had discovered the carved runes announcing Magnus's return. A chill ran down Sigrid's spine as she realized her son might have chosen that location for its significance, the place where his life had changed forever, now marked as the site of his homecoming. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly gathered the letter fragments and slipped them into a leather pouch before answering. Bjorn stood on her threshold, his usually confident bearing replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "We need to talk." Sigrid stepped aside to let him enter, noting how his eyes immediately went to the table where she had been examining the letters. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if he recognized what she had found. "You know about Ingrid," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know Magnus loved her. I know you helped them meet in secret. What I don't know is why you ultimately chose to destroy them both." Sigrid's voice carried carefully controlled anger. Bjorn moved to the hearth and stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking. "Because I was a coward. Because when the moment came to choose between love and duty, between truth and stability, I chose the path that seemed safest for everyone, except the two people I should have protected. Tell me what really happened." Magnus discovered that someone was selling alliance secrets to clan. "Grimson, the same clan that attacked us 3 nights ago." Bjorn's voice was heavy with old guilt. "He found evidence that sensitive information about our defenses, our trade routes, our political arrangements was being passed to our enemies." "Who was the traitor?" Bjorn was quiet for so long that Sigrid wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Helga's father, Thrand Ironbeard." The name hit Sigrid like a physical blow. Thrand Ironbeard was one of the most respected members of their council, a war hero whose counsel the Jarl valued above almost all others. He was also the man whose daughter Magnus had been expected to marry. Magnus was supposed to marry into a family of traitors? Magnus was supposed to cement an alliance that would have given Thrand even more access to sensitive information. Bjorn turned from the fire to face her. The marriage arrangement wasn't just about politics, it was about placing Thrand's family at the very center of our clan's decision-making. Sigrid felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place within day with horrible clarity. And when Magnus refused the marriage to pursue Ingrid instead, Thrand saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat while also strengthening his own position. He exposed Magnus's relationship with Ingrid, knowing it would force a choice between political stability and personal happiness. But Magnus had evidence of Thran's treachery, evidence that would have been dismissed as the desperate accusations of a young man trying to avoid an unwanted marriage. Bjorn's expression grew more pained. Without solid proof, Magnus's claims would have seemed like elaborate attempts to justify his defiance. Sigrid pulled the leather pouch from her belt and carefully extracted one of the letter fragments. "What about this? Bring the proof we found." "What proof?" Bjorn stared at the charred paper as if it were a ghost from his past. Documents that showed the pattern of information flow, the timing of Grimson raids, coinciding with council meetings Thran attended, payments made to intermediaries. He shook his head sadly. But the proof was hidden, and in the chaos of the exile, it was never recovered. Where was it hidden? That's what Magnus never had the chance to reveal. The exile happened too quickly, before he could pass the information to anyone who could act on it. Bjorn sat heavily in one of her chairs. "For 20 winters, I've wondered if we sent away the one person who could have saved us from years of raids and betrayal." Sigrid thought of the recent attack, of how well coordinated it had been, how the raiders had seemed to know exactly where to strike for maximum impact. "Thrand is still feeding information to Grimson. I believe so. But believing and proving are different things, especially when the accused is one of the Jarl's most trusted advisors." "What about Ingrid? What happened to her after Magnus left?" Bjorn's face clouded with pain. She was married to the Eastern clan leader as planned. The alliance her father needed was secured. But he paused, struggling with words. "She never forgave any of us for our part in separating her from Magnus. She withdrew from court life, became distant even from her own family. Does she know Magnus is alive? How could she? We've had no contact with him since the exile." Bjorn looked up sharply. "Why do you ask? Have you heard something?" Sigrid considered how much to reveal about the carved runes at the shrine. "I have reason to believe he may still be alive. And if he is, if he returns, then Thrand will try to kill him," Bjorn finished grimly. "Because Magnus is the only person who can identify him as a traitor, and 20 winters of successful deception won't be thrown away lightly. The implications settled over them like a shroud. If Magnus truly was preparing to return, he would be walking into deadly danger from someone who had spent 2 decades consolidating power and eliminating threats." "We have to warn him," Sigrid said. "How? We don't even know where he is." "Then we have to be ready to protect him when he arrives." She touched the broken sword hilt beneath her cloak. "And we have to find a way to expose Thrand before Magnus puts himself at risk." Bjorn studied her face in the candlelight. "You're talking about confronting one of the most powerful men in our clan, without solid evidence of his crimes. Then we find the evidence. Magnus hid proof of Thrand's treachery 20 winters ago. That proof might still exist, waiting to be discovered. Even if we found it, who would believe us? Who would take the word of an exiled traitor's mother and a guilt-ridden old advisor against Thrand Ironbeard?" Sigrid stood, feeling resolve crystallize in her chest like ice forming on still water. "Someone will. Someone has to. Because the alternative is watching my son die for the same truths that cost him everything once before." The charred letter fragments seemed to whisper from their pouch, carrying messages of love and loss across 20 winters of separation. But they also carried something else, evidence that the truth had been there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to piece it back together. The hidden scroll bore the royal seal of Jarl Edvin himself, its wax impression cracked with age, but still recognizable. Bjorn's hands shook as he unrolled it. On Sigrid's table, his face pale in the candlelight. They had found it exactly where his guilt-ridden memory had finally recalled, sewn into the lining of an old cloak he had worn the night of Magnus's exile, a document he had hidden and then tried to forget for 20 long winters. "I should have burned this years ago," he whispered. but his eyes remained fixed on the careful script that detailed agreements no honorable man should have made. Sigrid leaned closer to read the formal language that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just evidence of Thran's treachery, it was proof that Jarl Edvin himself had sanctioned it. Alliance Modification Treaty, sealed in secret council, she read aloud, whereby Jarl Edvin of Iron Fjord agrees to provide intelligence regarding coastal defences and trade routes to intermediaries acting on behalf of Clan Grimson in exchange for... She paused, her voice catching. In exchange for guaranteed safe passage for Iron Fjord ships and select raiding that eliminates competing settlements. The scroll detailed a conspiracy that went far beyond simple treachery. Edvin hadn't just allowed information to leak to enemies, he had actively collaborated with them to eliminate rival clans while protecting his own territory. The raids that had devastated neighboring settlements over the past 20 winters hadn't been random attacks. They had been orchestrated strikes designed to consolidate Edvin's power across the entire region. Magnus discovered this? Sigrid asked, though the answer was already clear from Bjorn's stricken expression. Not just discovered. He was there when the agreement was made. Bjorn's voice cracked with the weight of confession. Edvin had chosen him as a potential successor, someone young and capable who could be groomed to take over the alliance management. Magnus was supposed to witness the treaty signing as part of his education in leadership. The betrayal cut deeper than Sigrid had imagined possible. Her son hadn't stumbled upon evidence of treachery, he had been invited to become part of it. The exile wasn't just about silencing a threat, it was about eliminating a witness to the Jarl's greatest crime. Instead of embracing the arrangement, Magnus was horrified, Bjorn continued. He demanded to know how Edvin could justify collaborating with raiders who had killed innocent people from allied clans. When the Jarl tried to explain it as necessary political maneuvering, Magnus threatened to expose everything. So the love affair with Ingrid was a convenient excuse. The marriage refusal gave Edvin the justification he needed to exile Magnus without raising questions about the real reasons. Bjorn rolled the scroll carefully, as if it might crumble from his touch. But it was never about forbidden love or political alliances. It was about silencing the only person who could prove that our respected Jarl was a collaborator with the very enemies we thought we were fighting. Sigrid felt the world shifting around her as the full scope of the deception became clear. Every raid over the past 20 winters, every family destroyed, every warrior killed defending against Grimson attacks, all of it had happened with Edvin's knowledge and consent. The man she had saved 3 nights ago, the ruler she had sworn to serve, was directly responsible for decades of suffering. Thran knew about this too. Thran was Edvin's intermediary. The marriage between Magnus and Helga was meant to bring him into the conspiracy officially, to make him a full partner rather than just an agent. Bjorn's laugh was bitter and hollow. By refusing the marriage, Magnus unknowingly avoided becoming complicit in his own people's betrayal. The implications crashed over Sigrid like a cold wave. The 3 wishes she had been granted weren't a generous reward for saving the Jarl's life. They were a desperate attempt to control someone who had become dangerously curious about old secrets. Edvin was hoping to satisfy her need for answers while keeping the most damaging truths buried. Does Edvin know that you kept this document? He ordered me to destroy it the night of Magnus's exile. I told him I had burned it, but... Bjorn met her eyes with an expression of tortured conscience. I couldn't bring myself to eliminate the only proof of what we had done. Even as I helped orchestrate Magnus's banishment, some part of me hoped that someday the truth would matter more than political convenience. A new understanding dawned on Sigrid as she considered the recent raid that had brought her to this moment. The attack 3 nights ago, Edvin knew it was coming. More than knew, he helped plan it. Bjorn's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But something went wrong. The raiders were supposed to target specific buildings, eliminate certain people who had been asking too many questions about old inconsistencies in the raid patterns. Instead, they got caught up in actual fighting and lost control of the situation. I was one of the targets. You and two others who had been noticed asking questions about Magnus's exile and the timing of various attacks over the years. Bjorn nodded grimly. The Jarl couldn't risk having those questions gain momentum, especially not now. Why not now? What's changed? Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming nervously against the table. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of terrible revelation. Because Magnus isn't the only one who knows the truth anymore. 3 months ago, Edvin received a message from someone claiming to have detailed records of the conspiracy, including documents that prove the Jarl's involvement in planning specific raids. The sender demanded a meeting to discuss terms for keeping the information secret. Sigrid's heart began racing. Who sent the message? Someone with intimate knowledge of the original treaty arrangements. Someone who signed their message with Magnus's seal, the one he carried as a potential heir. Bjorn met her eyes directly. Sigrid, your son isn't just alive. He's been gathering evidence for 20 winters, building a case that could destroy Edvin's reputation and potentially bring down the entire power structure of our region. The carved runes at the shrine suddenly took on new meaning. Mother, soon. Not just a promise of reunion, but a warning of approaching reckoning. That's why Edvin granted you the 3 wishes, she realized. He's hoping to use me to draw Magnus out into the open, or to convince him that his family is safe and satisfied with the official explanations, so he'll abandon whatever plan he's developing. Bjorn's expression grew urgent, but if Magnus has spent 20 winters preparing for this moment, he won't be easily deterred. And if he returns with evidence that exposes the conspiracy, Edvin will have him killed before he can speak a word of it. Worse than that, Edvin will present him as a traitor returning to destabilize the region, someone working with Clan Grimson to undermine local defenses. Magnus's own evidence will be dismissed as enemy propaganda, and his death will be seen as necessary protection of the community. The scroll seemed to burn against the table's surface, as Sigrid realized the deadly trap that was closing around her family. Her son was returning not as a vindicated exile, but as a threat to powerful men who had spent decades covering their crimes. The wishes she had been granted weren't gifts, they were bait in a larger scheme to neutralize the only person who could expose the truth. "We have to warn him," she said. "How? We don't know where he is or when he plans to arrive." Bjorn's desperation was evident. "All we know is that he's coming, and when he does, he'll be walking into the most elaborate trap ever set in our region's history." Sigrid touched the broken sword hilt beneath her cloak, feeling its familiar weight. But now it represented something more than just her connection to Magnus. It was a reminder that some battles couldn't be won through strength alone. This would require cunning, allies, and a willingness to risk everything for the chance of justice. "Then we prepare our own trap," she said quietly, "and we make sure that when the truth finally comes to light, it's stronger than any lie they've built to contain it." The hidden scroll lay between them like evidence of a crime that had poisoned their entire world. But it was also something else, proof that the truth had survived 20 winters of concealment, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. The ancient navigation stone felt warm in Sigrid's palm as she stood at the edge of the fjord, watching the pre-dawn mist swirl across the dark water. The sunstone had belonged to her father, passed down through 3 generations of seafarers who had used it to find their way home, even in the cloudiest weather. Now she clutched it like a talisman, hoping it would guide her through the storm that was about to break over Ironfjord. 2 days had passed since Bjorn's devastating revelation, and the village buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone, though few understood its source. Sigrid had spent those days carefully building alliances among the people she trusted most, preparing for a confrontation that would either restore justice to their community or destroy what remained of her family. "Are you certain about this?" Astrid asked, approaching through the morning gloom with careful steps. Her old friend had aged visibly since learning the truth about Edvin's conspiracy, the weight of betrayal settling heavily on shoulders already bent by years of hard living. "I'm certain that doing nothing will get Magnus killed," Sigrid replied, slipping the navigation stone into her belt pouch. "If he's truly coming back with evidence against Edvin, he'll need allies waiting for him, people who know the truth and are willing to stand up for it." They had chosen their confidants carefully. Gunnar, the blacksmith, whose son had died in a Grimson raid 5 winters ago, a raid that they now knew Edvin had helped orchestrate. Old Eric, whose fishing grounds had been mysteriously spared when neighboring settlements were devastated. Finn, the record keeper, who had spent 20 winters carrying the guilt of his part in covering up the truth. Even young Olaf had been brought into their circle, his quick mind and nimble feet making him useful for carrying messages without attracting attention. It was a small group, but Sigrid had learned that revolutions often began with the courage of a few rather than the approval of many. "Gunnar has finished the preparations," Astrid reported. "If Magnus truly plans to reveal evidence at the next council meeting, we'll be ready to protect him long enough to speak his piece." The plan was necessarily simple. Magnus would likely arrive before the scheduled council session, seeking a public forum where his evidence could be presented to the entire community. Sigrid and her allies would position themselves throughout the Longhouse, ready to prevent Edvin's men from silencing her son before he could make his case. It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was better than allowing Magnus to walk unknowingly into an ambush. "What if we're wrong?" Astrid continued. "What if Magnus isn't coming back? Or what if he's changed so much that he no longer seeks justice?" Sigrid had wrestled with the same doubts during long, sleepless nights. 20 winters was a lifetime enough to change a passionate young man into someone entirely different. The son she remembered might no longer exist, replaced by a hardened exile with his own agenda. "Then we'll have risked everything for nothing," she admitted. "But if we're right, and we do nothing, then everything we've lost will have been for nothing as of, well." The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the mist to reveal fishing boats already at work on the fjord. Normal life continued around them, but Sigrid felt as if she was standing in the eye of a gathering hurricane. Soon, very soon, the careful lies that had held their community together would be tested against the power of long-buried truth. A commotion near the village center caught her attention, raised voices and the sound of running feet. Sigrid and Astrid exchanged worried glances before hurrying toward the disturbance. They found a crowd gathered around the longhouse, where Jarl Edvin stood on the raised platform, usually reserved for formal announcements. His face was grim, and Thrand Ironbeard flanked him with several armed warriors. The sight of so much military preparation in the heart of their peaceful village sent cold fear through Sigrid's chest. "People of Iron Fjord," Edvin called out, his voice carrying easily across the gathering crowd, "I have received disturbing intelligence that requires immediate action. It has come to my attention that enemies of our clan are planning to infiltrate our territory, bringing false accusations and forged documents designed to undermine the stability we have worked so hard to achieve." Sigrid felt her heart sink. Somehow, Edvin had learned of Magnus's approach and was preparing the community to reject whatever evidence her son might present. "These enemies will come disguised as friends," the Jarl continued. "They will claim to seek justice for old wrongs, but their true purpose is to destroy the alliances that have brought us peace and prosperity. They will present documents that appear authentic, testimony that seems compelling, all designed to turn us against our own leaders and plunge our region back into the chaos of constant warfare." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sigrid could see people nodding, accepting Edvin's framing of events before they had even occurred. The Jarl was masterfully preparing his audience to dismiss Magnus's evidence as enemy deception. "Therefore," Edvin announced, "I am declaring a state of emergency. All gatherings of more than 5 people are suspended until this threat passes. The council meeting scheduled for tomorrow is postponed indefinitely, and anyone found consorting with these infiltrators will be considered a collaborator in treason. The crowd began to disperse, but Sigrid caught the meaningful glances exchanged between Edvin and his inner circle. They weren't just preparing to defend against accusations, they were preparing to eliminate threats permanently. "We need to warn the others," Astrid whispered urgently. But as they turned to leave, Thrand Ironbeard's voice stopped them cold. "Sigrid Ravensblood," he called out, his tone deceptively friendly. "A word, if you please." There was no choice but to approach the platform, though every instinct screamed warnings. Thrand's smile was warm and paternal, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had spent decades maintaining deadly secrets. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your son," he said, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. "Perhaps it's time you considered using your remaining wishes with the Jarl to put these old sorrows to rest. A generous settlement, perhaps, and the promise of peaceful retirement. Surely that would be preferable to chasing shadows and disturbing the community's harmony." The offer was clearly a final attempt to buy her silence, but it was also a public test. How she responded would determine whether she was seen as a reasonable, grieving mother or as a dangerous disruptor of social order. "My wishes are my own to make," Sigrid replied carefully, "and I will make them when the time is right." "Of course," Thrand agreed, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I hope you'll remember that some gifts come with time limits. The Jarl's generosity, like his patience, is not infinite." The threat was clear enough. Accept the buy-off soon, or face the consequences of continued defiance. As Sigrid and Astrid finally managed to extract themselves from the crowd, they found Gunnar waiting for them near his forge. The blacksmith's face was dark with worry, and his massive hands clenched and unclenched as if seeking something to crush. "They killed my boy to protect their lives," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled rage. "Now they want to kill yours for the same reason. When do we stop letting them choose who lives and who dies?" "When we stop being afraid of the consequences," Sigrid replied, though she felt the truth of those words settling into her bones like winter cold. "Whatever happens next, we stand together. Magnus has spent 20 winters gathering the courage to face this moment. The least we can do is match his bravery." The navigation stone seemed to pulse against her hip, its ancient purpose suddenly clear. It wasn't meant to guide ships through physical storms, but to help lost souls find their way back to truth and justice. Her father would have understood that some voyages required sailing into dangerous waters, trusting that right navigation would eventually lead home. Tonight, under cover of darkness, they would take their final positions. Tomorrow, when Magnus arrived with 20 winters of gathered evidence, they would discover whether truth was indeed stronger than the elaborate lies built to contain it. The ancient stone had guided her ancestors through countless storms. Now it would have to guide them all through the most dangerous passage of their lives. The bronze scales of justice sat in the center of the longhouse like an ancient judge, their tarnished surface reflecting the flickering torchlight as the emergency assembly gathered. Sigrid recognized the ceremonial balance from formal legal proceedings of her youth. When disputes were settled through careful weighing of evidence and testimony, that Jarl Edvin had chosen to display them now suggested he intended this gathering to have the appearance of legitimate judgment, even as he prepared to condemn an innocent man. The longhouse filled slowly with villagers called from their evening meals by the urgent summons. Sigrid took her position near the eastern wall, close enough to intervene, but far enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Around the hall, she caught glimpses of her allies, Gunnar near the main entrance, Astrid by the hearth, young Olaf positioned where he could carry messages quickly, all of them waiting for a moment that might never come. "People of Iron Fjord," Jarl Edvin began, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority. "We gather tonight because the threat I warned you about has materialized. A man claiming to be Magnus Sigurdsson has been seen approaching our territory, accompanied by unknown warriors and carrying documents he claims prove corruption within our leadership. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people turned to look at Sigrid, their expressions ranging from sympathy to suspicion. She kept her face carefully neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. This impostor seeks to exploit the natural grief of a mother. Edvin continued, by claiming identity with her lost son. But I have reliable intelligence that this is an agent of Clan Grimson, sent to weaken our unity with forged documents and false testimony. Thrand Ironbeard stepped forward, his weathered face a mask of righteous concern. I have examined samples of these supposed documents, he announced. The script appears to be a clever forgery of our official hand, but close inspection reveals foreign influences in the letter forms. This is clearly the work of enemy scribes attempting to discredit our alliance arrangements. Sigrid felt cold, rage building in her chest. The man who had betrayed them for 20 winters was now positioning himself as the expert who would expose her son's deception. The bronze scales seemed to mock the proceedings with their promise of fair judgment in a hall where justice had already been predetermined. Therefore, Edvin declared, when this impostor arrives, he will be arrested as a foreign agent and held for proper interrogation. Any who aid him will be considered collaborators with enemy forces. What if he really is Magnus? The voice belonged to Eric's wife, a woman whose courage had grown with her years. What if the documents are genuine? Then we will determine that through proper examination, Thrand replied smoothly. But we must not allow sentiment to override security. Too much depends on maintaining the stability we have achieved. Sigrid could remain silent no longer. And what of the mother's right to see her son? She asked, stepping forward from her position against the wall. What of the obligation to hear testimony from one of our own people before condemning him as a foreign agent? Edvin's eyes fixed on her with careful calculation. Your grief is understood, Sigrid, but it must not be allowed to compromise our collective safety. If this man is truly your son, then proper procedures will establish his identity. If he is an impostor, then your protection requires keeping you far from his deceptions. I have 2 wishes remaining, Sigrid said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the hall. I use my second wish now. I demand the right to be present when this man is questioned and to hear his testimony with my own ears. The declaration sent a visible shock through Edvin's composure. He had clearly hoped to resolve the situation without having to honor his remaining obligations to her. But with the entire village watching, he could not refuse a formally stated wish without destroying his own credibility. Very well, he said after a long pause. Your second wish is granted. You may be present during the questioning, but you will be protected by guards, and any attempt to interfere with proper procedures will void your remaining wishes. It was a partial victory, but Sigrid could see the trap within it. She would be allowed to witness her son's interrogation, but under conditions that would prevent her from effectively helping him. Still, it was better than complete exclusion from the proceedings. The assembly is dismissed, Edvin announced. Return to your homes and remain alert. When the impostor arrives, justice will be swift and thorough. As the crowd began to disperse, Sigrid caught Gunnar's eye and saw her own determination reflected in his weathered features. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The bronze scales of justice would witness either the triumph of truth or its final burial, but they would not witness surrender. The ancient balance had presided over countless judgments in this hall, weighing evidence and testimony to determine guilt or innocence. Tonight, it would weigh something far more precious: the fate of a family reunited after 20 winters of separation, and the future of a community built on lies. Magnus was coming home, and Ironfjord would finally learn whether justice was stronger than the power that had corrupted it. Magnus walked through the longhouse doors like a ghost returning from the dead, and Sigrid felt her heart stop at the sight of her son after 20 winters of absence. He was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders, with silver threading through his dark beard and lines around his eyes that spoke of hardships endured far from home. But his bearing was unmistakably that of the proud young man she had raised, and when his gaze found hers across the crowded hall, she saw recognition flash in depths that held her own stubborn determination. He carried himself like a leader now, flanked by 3 weathered warriors, whose bearing suggested they had followed him through many battles. More importantly, he carried a leather satchel that seemed to draw every eye in the room, the repository of evidence that could either vindicate him or seal his doom. "I am Magnus Sigurdsson," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence. "Son of this village, heir to the Raven Banner, and I have returned to claim justice for crimes committed against our people." Jarl Edvin rose from his carved chair, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished next to Magnus's quiet authority. "You will submit to questioning regarding your identity and the nature of your claims," the Jarl commanded. "Guards, secure the prisoners." But Magnus held up a carved wooden pendant that made several of the older villagers gasp in recognition. Sigrid's breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. It was the return token her son had made as a boy, carved with protective runes and blessed at the shrine. The same token she had watched him craft with his small hands, working by firelight while she told him stories of their ancestors. "I carry the proof of my identity," Magnus said, his voice growing stronger. "And more than that, I carry proof of betrayals that have cost our region decades of unnecessary suffering." Thrand stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Documents can be forged. Tokens can be stolen. What proof do you offer that you are not simply a clever spy sent to disrupt our unity?" Magnus's smile was cold as winter ice. "I offer the testimony of someone who was there when the treachery began. Someone whose word even you cannot dismiss as foreign deception." He gestured toward the longhouse entrance, where a new figure emerged from the shadows. Sigrid's world tilted on its axis as she recognized the woman walking into the torchlight, older now, her blonde hair streaked with silver, but unmistakably the proud bearing of nobility. Ingrid Eriksdottir entered the hall like a queen returning to claim her throne. "I am Ingrid, daughter of Eric the Bold, wife to Jarl Sten, of the Eastern clans," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her bloodline. "And I stand as witness to the treachery of Jarl Edvin and his collaborator Thrand Ironbeard." The effect was immediate and devastating. Ingrid's presence transformed the entire nature of the proceedings. No one could dismiss her as a foreign agent or question her identity. Her word carried the weight of major alliances, and her testimony could not be suppressed without risking war with the most powerful clans in the region. Edvin's face went pale as death. "Ingrid Eriksdottir has no authority in our territory. Her presence here is an unwelcome interference in our internal affairs." "My presence here," Ingrid replied coolly, "is as the representative of every clan that has suffered from your collaborative arrangements with Clan Grimson. Every settlement burned while yours remained untouched. Every trade route raided while yours prospered. Every family destroyed while you counted the profits from your betrayal." Magnus opened his leather satchel and withdrew documents that seemed to glow in the torchlight. 20 winters ago, I was invited to witness the signing of a secret agreement, an arrangement that made Jarl Edvin a collaborator with our enemies, using them to eliminate rival settlements while enriching himself through selective protection. Lies. Thrand shouted, but his voice cracked with desperation. Enemy propaganda designed to destroy our legitimate alliances. "Then you won't mind if we examine the documents," Sigrid said, stepping forward. "I use my third and final wish, Jarl Edvin. I wish for the truth to be heard, completely and without interference, before this entire assembly." Magnus spread the first document across the bronze scales of justice, its official seals and formal script visible to everyone in the hall. The scroll that Bjorn had hidden for 20 winters was now joined by others, correspondence between Edvin and Grimson agents, payment records, detailed intelligence reports that had been sold to enemies. "This is the true record," Magnus declared. "Not just of my exile, but of every life lost to maintain this conspiracy. Every raid that succeeded because our defenses were compromised. Every family destroyed to protect these men's secrets." Ingrid stepped beside him, her noble presence lending weight to his words. "The Eastern clans have spent 5 winters investigating the pattern of raids that seem to target everyone except Ironifjord. The evidence led us to these documents and to the terrible realization that peace had been purchased through the blood of innocents." The longhouse erupted in shocked voices as people processed the magnitude of the betrayal. But Sigrid's attention remained fixed on her son, marveling at the man he had become. The broken boy who had left in shame had returned as a leader capable of exposing the greatest conspiracy their region had ever known. The wooden return token in his hand seemed to bridge 20 winters of separation, promising that some bonds could survive even the worst betrayals. The new family pendant caught the morning sunlight as Sigrid fastened it around her neck, its fresh forged metal warm against her skin. Magnus had commissioned it from Gunnar's forge the week before, a design that combined her raven symbol with the wolf emblem he had adopted during his years in exile. The piece represented something neither had dared hope for during the long winters of separation, the healing of bonds that betrayal had tried to break. 2 months had passed since the night of revelations that changed everything in Ironfjord. The Longhouse had erupted in chaos as the full scope of Edvin's conspiracy became clear, with villagers demanding justice for decades of manipulation and loss. The bronze scales of justice had finally served their true purpose, weighing evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Edvin and Thrand now awaited a trial in the Eastern Territories, where Ingrid's father would preside over proceedings that would determine their fate. The preliminary judgment had been swift, both men stripped of rank and property, their families offered the choice of exile or remaining under close supervision. Most had chosen to leave, seeking fresh starts in territories where their names carried no weight. "The Council has reached a decision about the leadership question," Magnus said, settling beside her on the bench outside her small house. At 32 winters, he carried himself with the quiet authority that had impressed even the most skeptical villagers. His years of exile had taught him skills that peace could never have provided: diplomacy, strategic thinking, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that came from surviving betrayal and building something better from its ashes. "And?" Sigrid asked, though she suspected what the answer would be. "They want me to serve as interim Jarl until proper elections can be held." Magnus's expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "It seems that exposing corruption carries certain obligations." Sigrid studied her son's face, noting the careful consideration he gave to every decision. The passionate young man who had left in shame had returned as someone who understood the weight of leadership and the price of justice. But she also saw traces of the boy she had raised, the same stubborn determination to do what was right, regardless of personal cost. "Will you accept?" "Only if you'll serve as my chief advisor," he replied with a slight smile. "It seems the village has developed considerable respect for mothers who refuse to give up on their children." The offer touched something deep in Sigrid's chest. After 20 winters of isolation and irrelevance, the community was asking her to help guide its future. The woman, who had been marginalized for her inconvenient questions, was now valued for the persistence that had uncovered the truth. "I'm an old shield-maiden who tends gardens and argues with record-keepers," she protested gently. "You're a warrior who fought for justice when everyone else accepted comfortable lies," Magnus corrected. "The village needs that kind of courage in its leadership." Through the weeks following the revelation, Sigrid had watched her son work to rebuild trust within a community that had been shattered by the scale of its leader's betrayal. He had insisted on transparency in all proceedings, open access to all records, and the establishment of systems that would prevent future corruption. More importantly, he had worked to heal the divisions that 20 winters of selective protection had created among neighboring settlements. Ingrid had proven instrumental in that healing process. Her marriage to the Eastern Jarl provided diplomatic channels that Magnus used to establish new, honest alliances. The love affair that had once threatened regional stability was now helping to restore it. Though both she and Magnus had accepted that their paths lay in different directions, some wounds, once healed, left people stronger, but forever changed. "What about Bjorn?" Sigrid asked. The former advisor had spent the weeks since the revelation wrestling with guilt over his role in the conspiracy. His confession and cooperation had earned him clemency, but his own conscience proved a harsher judge than any court. "He's asked to serve as keeper of records, under Finn's supervision," Magnus replied. "He wants to spend whatever years remain to him, ensuring that future generations have access to complete, honest accounts of these events. It seems appropriate, the man who helped bury the truth now dedicating himself to preserving it." A group of children ran past their house, laughing as they chased each other toward the fjord. Among them, Sigrid recognized several whose fathers had died in raids that could have been prevented if the truth had been known sooner. Their laughter was a reminder that life continued, that communities could heal even from the deepest betrayals. "I've been thinking about the wishes," she said quietly. 3 requests that seemed so important, but in the end, only the search for truth mattered. Magnus nodded thoughtfully. "The gods have strange ways of giving us what we need, rather than what we think we want. You asked for truth, and it brought justice. But more than that, it brought us back to each other." The new pendant seemed to pulse with warmth against Sigrid's chest, its fresh metal already beginning to take on the patina that would mark years of wearing. Unlike the broken sword hilt she had carried for 20 winters, this piece represented renewal rather than loss, hope rather than grief. As the sun climbed higher over Iron Fjord, Sigrid felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, contentment with the present, rather than longing for an impossible past. Her son was home, her community was healing, and the truth that had been buried for 20 winters was finally taking root in fertile soil. The raven and wolf emblems on her pendant caught the light as she stood to begin another day. Different symbols, forged together into something stronger than either could have been alone. Like her family, like her community. Like the justice that had finally found its way home through the persistence of an aging shield-maiden who had refused to let go of hope. Some battles, she reflected, were won not through strength of arms, but through strength of heart. And some victories were worth waiting 20 winters to achieve.